our ITS specialist, Mr. Hackett, and of the art department, and I launched the lecture and workshop series in 2016 to showcase individuals who make work that crosses disciplines in interesting and exciting ways. As we continue to think about the library and the CTC as a creative space where students and teachers come together and create without the confines of departmental walls, we hope to keep bringing in creative thinkers whose work exemplifies an interdisciplinary kind of learning, which will in turn help to inspire the work that happens here at WHS. It was so nice for students to be able to come together today from all different departments and to work collaboratively. I hope that the students who participated in our activities left feeling inspired. Big ideas don't happen in a vacuum. They take lots of minds working together to start to make big changes. I would like to briefly thank some of the people who made today possible. Mrs. Grace and Mrs. Gambardella in the library, Mr. K and his fabrication classes for their amazing efforts in building and pulling together the dome, Mr. Hackett and his classes for helping to put the dome together, Mr. McKenzie, Kayla Avatable and WinCam for promoting and broadcasting this event, the entire art department, Ms. Often for her help with data analysis, Ms. Chocladar, Russet Levine, WHS alumni Danielle Magno for her delicious baked goods from her farm, Senza Scarpe in Brunswick, Maine, Right Lock Farm, the Winchester Cultural District, Mark Winter from Recover Green Roofs, and Laura Turin from Sustainable Winchester, Mr. B and the students that played music today, and all of the teachers that were here all day helping. Thank you all so much. The work you see here today, the work that you see here today was inspired by the work of our visiting artist, Mary Mattingly. I have been admiring Mary's work for over a decade and was lucky enough to have her as a mentor in college. Back in 2009, I was walking through Brooklyn, New York when I stumbled upon Mary's Water Pod, a publicly accessible barge and artist commune that was in the middle of its 6-month tour of New York City's waterways. The Water Pod was a prototype for ecological sustainability in sculptural form. On board the barge, its occupants gathered and treated rainwater for eating, bathing, and cleaning. They used solar and wind energy for power, recycled and composted all their waste, and grew much of their food. The Water Pod asked visitors to consider alternatives for a sustainable local ecology. Flying high in the sky was a flag that read, "I remember Earth." Mary's grim outlook on the future with climate change on the horizon prompted her interest in a different way of living and working. She considers her work to be a sort of utopia, a space to capture people's imaginations and a place to educate them in the process. Since the Water Pod, Mary has continued to make work that asks important questions of us. Who has access? Who has control? Where does our water come from? What if food could be a human right? How could public parks help relieve urban hunger? Her work asks us to consider our role in the global economy. What compels me about Mary's work is her ability to activate communities. Mary works with artists, designers, builders, civic activists, scientists, environmentalists, and marine engineers. She is in the center, orchestrating them all. I'm excited by the way that Mary's work galvanizes her audience to take action. Her work inspires her belief that our shared responsibility to care for the earth and each other. Mary's work is both action and art. She is deeply concerned with the many global challenges facing our society, including rising sea levels, urban hunger, and access to clean water. Her approach asks us to think about regenerative, eco-social systems and imagine a new way of living for a brighter future. Her work also shows us that people who have an investment and who get their livelihood from an ecosystem have a commitment to protecting it. Mary is based out of New York City. Her many accomplishments include exhibitions at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the Seoul Art Center, the Bronx Museum of Art, Storm King, the New York Public Library, the DeCordova Museum and Sculpture Park, among others. She was awarded grants from the James L. Knight Foundation, the Yale School of Art, the I-Beam Center, and the Jerome Foundation. Her work has been featured in Aperture Magazine, Art in America, Art Forum, the New York Times, Le Monde Magazine, BBC News, NPR, among many other places. Most recently, she was awarded a 2023 John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship. It is such an honor to have Mary with us today. Please join me in welcoming her to Winchester High.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Andrea, for arranging today. It's been phenomenal to see the projects that some of you have come up with, and I was really inspired, so I'm really hopeful that we continue this through Andrea and through different conversations that we'll have in the future, hopefully, and I'd love to see where you guys go and what your work is about, so thanks for giving me this time to hear a little bit about what I've been doing. I call all of the work that I do proposals, and I started as a photographer, so that's my training. I'll show you some of the images. So I don't know if you can see this, if you guys in the back are close enough. It's a pretty small screen, but feel free to come up forward if you want. Most of the sculptural work I do sort of started from photography, and I'll show you that in a second. But I have been focusing on sculpture for a long time because of my interest in reusing infrastructure that already exists in the world, whether it's military infrastructure, whether it's from the waste stream, metals, woods, fabrics, vinyl, all that kind of stuff. And to step back a little bit, the photography that I was doing, I called a proposal. So they were always collages, and they were trying to depict a future that I thought was more and more possible. The work, I'll say, got pretty depressing after 6 years of doing it and thinking through all the potential catastrophes, but I did about 6 years of proposal making through photography, and then I started to use photography as documentary, so to document the sculptures that I'll talk more about. And then finally, maybe as I threw all the photographs into sculptures, so the photographs became sculptures themselves. But this is how I really start the process. I start through drawing. Is anybody an artist in the room? Or called themselves or think, yes. So I don't know how you start, but usually my process starts through drawing, and then I go to collage, like collaging magazines and images together just by hand, and then I go to the computer. And I focus on topics of food, water, and shelter to make the sculptures. These I called wearable homes, and they were living units that had 3 different layers. This is a water layer, so it blew up in the water, so in theory you could float. It didn't really work that well. You could see that if you were actually wearing this blown up, you would kind of sink to the bottom, and the flotation would be on top. So they're pretty absurd, but the idea was that they were semi-practical. So this layer would become a tent at night, and you could wear it during the day and carry your belongings. There was a layer for an Arctic tundra and a desert tundra, and then the water layer. I worked on it for a long time. Okay, so then I started to build these larger scale ecosystems, and the point was really to think like how the larger scale ecosystems worked with a lot of people. So I needed to learn how to farm, and I needed to learn how to engineer the structure. So I started to work with engineers and farmers and builders. My brother's a builder, and make these systems that people could walk into, these small ecosystems, and see where they're working and see where they're not working. So this is a hydroponic system. Anybody know? Hydroponic system, and then there's also an aquaponic system. So there were fish in this system, so there are little fish tanks that would feed off of the soil, the nutrients from the soil from the plants, and if everything was working right, the fish wouldn't die, the plants would be thriving. If something was going wrong, you would know immediately and you'd need to fix it. So you could think about that as a small scale ecosystem that's big enough for a human for us to sort of get into and see where it's going wrong. But it relates to the larger ecosystem we're inside of, like the world. This is another iteration of that. This one you can really see how you could maybe think through living in a micro ecosystem with maybe everything that you needed to live. This was in a school in Staten Island. This is a picture of a sculpture that cleaned water. So here, rainwater's coming in from the top. It's running into these plant filtration systems, and they work just through the soil itself. Cleans water, of course, and Then there's a layer of carbon. So if you're interested, I can talk more about the carbon layer, which is a really exciting, important layer. And then there's gravel. And after that, you could get to the bottom of this ecosystem. Here you see the top. At the bottom, you could actually drink the water from it. Same concept. I love spheres and domes. This is in the Brooklyn Public Library, and these are all the future plants for New York City. So if you think through climate change and what plants will be growing in the near future in New York City, according to scientists, we'll have more palms, we'll have more plants that survive in warmer temperatures. And you can find them actually in the fossil record from the Eocene in the area of New York State. These plants were already growing there 55 million years ago, if that matters. We know they can survive. This is a portable garden in Anchorage, Alaska. Again, it's looking at what plants will thrive in a near future when the temperature gets warmer. So this worked in the summertime. We know it wouldn't have worked in the winter in Anchorage right now, but it's portable, so we moved it inside, and the thinking was in the near future, these plants might actually thrive. You guys can stop me if you have questions too. I'm gonna go through this section pretty quick. This is called Flock House. I worked with people in design charrettes. So that's like an architectural process where you would sit at a table and you would, kind of like what you did today, think through what would the ecosystem I could stand to live in be? Like what would it have to look like? How would it function? How could it maybe potentially move? And could we make that into an event space? So with this project, it always moved around. This is in Omaha, Nebraska. And people inhabited it. Sometimes they tried staying overnight, but usually it was used for events, like for music, for artists to work in, and for people to come and see what they were doing. This is a little bit bigger. Somebody actually did try living in here. And I'll show you a quick video about that, if the sound works, which I didn't test. Let's see. It's okay. I don't know if you can hear that, but.
This is Triple Island, a project designed and carried out by Mary Mattingly. It's a soul-supporting sustainable environment that acts as a temporary habitat for residents to live in. The installation is solar-powered, has rain-collecting system, and is equipped with a greenhouse. As a public experiment, Triple Island is an approach to living in a future New York, replete with increasing acceleration of environmental changes. Triple Island is built on the East River waterfront on Pier 42, located between Manhattan and Williamsburg bridges. Paths to the Pier 42 is a series of art installation and public programming aimed at activating and increases access to the pier, which is undergoing radical changes and will be transformed into a new public park. My husband and I have been invited by Mary to occupy Triple Island, and we are now living on the pier. There have been other residents before us. We live a slow life in the heart of the crazy, headache area between FDR and East River. The experience is incredible. We look at the city from our hexagon and it seems unrecognizable. Our routine is simple. We wake up early in the morning, have breakfast, and Danny goes to work. I sit down on a bench with my computer. When he comes back, we have lunch, and then we work some more on our laptops. Maybe some friends stop by in the evening. Then the air starts to become chilly, because it's mid-September. We water the plants, have dinner, and go to sleep in our sleeping bags. I convinced Danny to spend a couple of weeks here because I very much wanted to find out more about the Lower East Side and the people who live here, their lifestyles, concerns, conflicts, and wishes. I knew it would result in something interesting. And the result is that while living here, I'm developing a project for the Rhizomatic Museum. The project is called Sound Gallery of People's Heard Stories of Pier 42. And what I'm doing is collected by audio recordings, the anecdotes, experiences, family backgrounds, and more, directly from the people who have lived in or around Pier 42 for many years. We know this place has gone through a huge transformation process in the last years, is still changing, and will become a totally different place in the near future. So I decided to create a sound archive with the stories of the former residents because I want to give the local community the space to remember events of the past and the younger ones to get to know about the place and its inhabitants. The official history may provide facts, dates, but the people's personal stories tell a different tale. Lots of people from the neighborhood are curious about Mary's piece and want to know what it is like to live here, if we are afraid of spending the nights alone, how do we take showers, and so on. I answer the questions and take the chance of asking them questions in return about their life in the Lower East Side, their relationships to the Pier 42 and the Israel waterfront, and what they remember of old times. The experience of living in the Pier 42 is giving us more than we expected. Not only are we learning about the place and its people, but we are also making friends. They come to visit from time to time. We know the whole area is suffering from a slow but sure gentrification process, and we keep wondering what it will look like when we come back 10 years from now, and if our friends from the Pier 42 will still be here to welcome us.
Yeah, so that's the story of like one group of people who inhabited the space in order to use it as a platform for their work. But the bigger point of that park was pretty profound. Like better than that little project within the park was the fact that 6 neighborhood groups in an arts organization got together and they said, hey, this is going to be developed into a condo, or we're going to program public artworks for the next 3 years to get enough people here to say, actually, we want this to be a park. And so it took them 3 years, but they did turn it into a park instead of a development. And that sort of struck me as one way that actually public art can work. So I had never thought of public art as a way to stop or change what might be developed in a place. And that was the effect of that larger scale project. So here is a project that I worked on that Andrea was talking about called the Water Pod, and I'll talk more about it in a second. It's the largest scale ecosystem, I think. So in terms of the talking through like what it means to make a living unit versus something that you can walk into versus something that really felt like a world. And I think what attracted me to boats was really that idea that on here you can see when anything is going wrong. So we had a dry composting toilet on here. We had 5 gardens, 4 chickens, and tried to just live with everything that was on the barge. And as soon as somebody was eating something from outside of the system, like everybody felt it in the system. It was that connected. So I think it's eerily small, but you could think about that on a large scale and the effect of 5 people's actions on each other and a larger scale. So maybe again, to zoom out to the more absurd, this is in upstate New York, and this is actually a sculpture. It's 3 palm trees planted in upstate New York to, again, acknowledge that in the fossil record of upstate New York, these trees were there and they may come back. And Forest Service in the United States is working on assisted plant migration, where they actually move lots of trees from warmer climates to colder climates in anticipation of this. It's not this extreme, but it is the same idea. Similar concept, this is on the Thames, and these are Nipa palms, and Nipa palms used to grow all up and down the Thames. They're now found in other parts of the world that are much warmer, but they held the soils together, and thinking through what would happen if Nipa palms were back in the Thames with flooding that the South End is going through right now. It's an interesting, I think, proposition. And finally, this proposal is called Swale, and I'll talk more about that in a second too. The second barge project was easier than the first. Some groups worked on data visualizations today, and this is probably, I think, the closest project that I have to a data visualization. This is in Glacier National Park. It's an old brewery, and ice and snow was collected from the roof of this brewery, and it was pumped through the building. So on the second floor, there were these water cisterns that held that melt water, and then through irrigation, it just was dripping into these vessels. When the vessels filled up, they overflowed onto the floor, and maybe I have some audio of this. Let's see. And it kept time. Let's see. So it kind of sounds like drums, and when it was cold, it wouldn't run at all, and then when it was really warm, it started to really drip and make noise. Okay, that's that. So I want to talk about two different projects. The first one is WaterPod, and the second is Swale. And please ask me questions during if you want. I'll tell you about my background. I grew up on the border of Springfield, Massachusetts, in a town called Somersville, Connecticut. It's an agricultural town, and the drinking water was polluted, so we always had to think about where our drinking water was coming from, and probably usually buy it from a store, but sometimes it wasn't an option. So the work that I was making in the beginning with the wearable homes was really trying to address that. It was thinking through water purification systems that would be embedded in your clothes, all of the potential dystopic futures I could imagine were built into those suits, but it really came from growing up in a place where I was really worried about where the water was coming from. And flooding would happen in the spring, and then the rest of the time we were just worried about its cleanliness. I also organized events, so when I was like your age, there were all these mills in that town, and I would sneak into them with friends and throw parties. That was the thing that we did so we wouldn't be bored. And then I got out of that town and moved to a place where there were a lot more exciting things, so I didn't need to do that. But I moved to the west coast of Portland, Oregon, worked there for a while, and then moved to New York City. It was like, this place is so expensive. How am I going to afford to live? What does my art mean here? There's so many artists, and they're doing amazing work. So I just started thinking through my living situation, and water came up as the obvious solution, I think. So I started to conceptualize a place to live on the water, and this is while I was doing photography, and I was working with a photo gallery, and I was really depressed by the photographs that I was making that were pretty dystopic. So I thought, I'm going to make this living system, I'm going to live in it, and I'm going to figure out how to make it work. And this was the first drawing. I took it to the US Coast Guard because I asked some arts organizations, and they said, hey, there's no way you'll be able to do this here, but if you want to know why, you should ask the Coast Guard. So I called them up, and I don't know if anybody's ever talked with them or has family that's part of the Coast Guard. They don't really hear from artists ever, and they didn't know what to do. So they said, we're a little bit worried. We're going to set up a meeting with you before you do this. Please come in to see us. So about 6 months later, I had a meeting set up with the US Coast Guard and asked 4 friends of mine to play roles as people who were going to build this boat for New York's harbor. We went into the meeting, we acted as professional as possible, not really knowing the routes for doing this. Left the meeting, they said, there's no way we'll let you do this unless you have $10 million, 10 years of engineering experience, or if you build this in a completely different way. So what we like about it is that there's no runoff into the ocean. This is what we deal with from boats all the time, is like people dumping sewage into the water. So I said, okay, great, so the Coast Guard's behind this project, we just have to figure out how to do it differently. So we went, from that point, there were lots more meetings with lots of different city officials where I would say, hey, so the Coast Guard is into this project, now we just need your help with permitting it. What do you need from us? And over the process of 3 years, and actually working with a lot of young people to redesign it on a pre-made structure on a barge, it finally ended up being something that they accepted. And being a complete living system where I did have to work with engineers, architects, scientists, and ecologists, and had to do all this paperwork. I had to form a company. I had to sign a 48-page contract with New York City, deeming me liable for anybody getting hurt on it. I had to get permits for everything, including the 4 chickens to be photographed by the Actors Guild because they were playing a role in a play, they thought. So the chickens needed their own permits. That was the most ridiculous. It was ridiculous. But so anyway, finally we had this barge that we could borrow for the length of 6 months because New York City said, yeah, sure, we'll let you do this, but only for 6 months. You can dock at public piers for free, but then it has to go away. So we said, okay, we're going to do it, and we'll see what happens. And so we got all this wood for free from National Park Service. They had been saving it after a stage performance they did, and we used it to build these buildings. We used art crates to build a chicken coop, and we found all these billboards to use to cover the dome that is kind of like the one that's over here. And actually, people in different schools around New York City grew seedlings that we were able to plant on the barge to eat from. So here's it coming together. And of course, here's what it ended up looking like. It's not really what the drawings look like, but it worked. So these are 4 cabins back here. That's where I lived in one of them, and then 3 friends lived in others. Kitchen, a shower. Rainwater was collected from these rooftops. There are solar panels on this roof. This tugboat was only here when we had to move to another pier. And this is a 1,500-gallon tank for rainwater collection from those rooftops. 5 garden beds around the perimeter. There's a greenhouse here, and then this is an event space. The chickens are back there, and we cleaned rainwater, and then there was also a dry composting toilet. That's one of the people who lived on it, Myra, climbing the dome. There's the flag. People started to come here and promote their products and their projects. So this is a man named Bob Highland, and he had made these sub-irrigated planters from scrap. He wanted to teach people how to do it, so he would come on every weekend. People would come for school days. That person is riding a bike that would power a phone. Didn't work that well. People would come on for music, for artist lectures. There's an artist doing a lecture, and also to go fishing. You can fish in the East River if you eat striped bass. Chicken, greenhouse. You can see how messy it was. This would never be acceptable to a boater. That's the gardens when they're looking really good. And I'll just show you 3 minutes of life on board.
From the moment
It's a really old video.
throughout my dream cycle to the moment I wake up, it's impossible to not become a part of the organism that is made up by all the people, by the plants, by the water, by the sun. It's like every moment that you're on board, you are a part of this system.
I think that the water pod can be a positive solution to something that is very foreseeable in the future, which is lack of resources, lack of clean water, lack of usable land. The water pod is a floating sculptural living system that has 4 residents living and working on board and creating all of their food, power, and water to make an autonomous space. This water pod is sort of a fantastical view of the future, and it draws people in and it gets them interested in thinking about all these things on one level or another. When we collect food from the garden, we change the way the garden looks. So any little thing that we do to alter it is mutating the sculpture. So you start with nothing, and then through the collection of lots of talented people, you can slowly start to build something and form something that's a living sculpture. It's a public and a private space at the same time. So when people come on board, we get to tour them through the space and show them what's going on. And you're always open to questions and open to finding solutions for things.
The water pod is participatory, it is technological, it's artistic, it's ecological, it's sustainable, and sometimes those don't match. It's wonderful, it's home.
It's been interesting as a social experiment and dealing with the people you live with in a really intense way, and also dealing with the public is really awesome. It's also about inspiring change in people through art and through ecological design, and so those sort of things are going through my head all the time about how to live in a confined space and be self-sufficient but also have a lot of fun.
Okay, I'm gonna stop it there. We do have wire. Okay, so yeah, that happened. And when I got back to land, I was like, oh, I have so much stuff. We didn't have a trash system for trash on the water pod, and so I was kind of obsessed with how many things I was saving in my life, and I made this website called ownit.us, and it's all the possessions that I had at the time, and I started to trace their supply chain to figure out how they were made and where the parts were from. And yeah, it ended up being another art project, and this was about my own consumption. So you could go onto this website and download 3D renderings or MP3s or PDFs of any of the objects. And then I made these and called them sculptures. There were 7 of them. I rolled them sometimes in performance art, or I made photographs from them. And that's how I kind of had the memories of the things that I was ready to, I guess, make art out of. I don't know, it was 13 years ago. Yeah, so I made all these photos from that stuff. It's really about the supply chain and what I owned. That's the transition, and the last project I wanted to share is called Swale, and I think about it as a provocation. So if public art has different uses in public space, one of them I think is as provocation. And what I mean by that is Swale was a floating food forest. It's a 130 by 40 foot deck barge. It's a place where anybody could go to pick fresh foods for free in a city where it's illegal to do that on public land. So in New York, coming from a place where I lived in agricultural land, we would forage all the time, and it was never illegal. So I think understanding that, like the 30,000 acres of public parkland that New York City cares for, you're not allowed to take anything from there. I mean, it makes sense logically because everybody would probably pick the flowers and like have them in their kitchen, and they wouldn't be there for other people to enjoy. But what if there was one more use for public parks that really had to do with the people who live in a city, making it more sustainable and getting access to foods from parks. So we have 100 acres of community garden space in New York City right now, which is completely different. Like you have a plot of land and some people have access to it and can grow food and pick it and give it away. But this would open up these 30,000 acres. So part of the point of Swale was to think through, like to dock this barge on public water and follow the public water rules versus the public land rules, but be attached to the public park. So people picking, this is in Brooklyn now. This image is in the Bronx, this is in Brooklyn. And this was much easier to do because the water pod had gone to the same piers and had, through that project, I had the chance to meet all the community groups and to establish relationships. So people really helped build this project from those community groups and wanted it to come back and stay for a long time. So here you can see all the edibles, the medicinals, like all the foods that could be harvested and other plants that could be harvested. Part of what I like to talk about is that, like the difference between a commons and how a commons can be cared for versus public space. And this is really somewhere in between, where it depended on people who knew each other in a particular neighborhood coming on, caring for it, and picking from it. And people who got together who could not only care for it, but also felt agency from being able to care for it. And that opened up the Parks Department to wanting to do this on public land. So now there is one place in a park in the Bronx at Concrete Plant Park where the city did plant a 7-acre public foodway. It's the only place that you can legally forage in a New York City park. And it just came about through all of these meetings with the Parks Department, with community garden coalitions, and with people in neighborhoods who wanted this to happen there. So this is the last video I'll show, and then I want to open it up for questions.
The South Bronx in New York City is one of the largest food deserts in the nation, with minimal access to fresh, affordable food. A century-old ordinance prevents planting in public parks, so rather than solve the problem by land, a new initiative calling itself a floating food forest is approaching it by water. CBSN climbed aboard.
Your parents give you $5 and you're like, how am I gonna make these $5 stretch? You're like, oh, could I get a salad? And you find out that it's $9 and you're like, I only have $5. We don't see like fresh mint, fresh peaches, fresh apples, fresh lavender, you don't see it in the local community, in the supermarkets or in the bodegas. So you tend to shy away from the healthy options. And it's sad.
Swale is a floating food forest. It's using the language that policies are written in to go around those policies and grow food on water instead of on land, because it's illegal to be on land doing this.
I heard the term food desert being thrown around because we don't have access to a lot of green, right? A lot of fruits and vegetables that we're able to incorporate into our everyday life.
There's people from California, there's people from Brooklyn, there's people from Chicago that came here recently, and other places that are able to say, like, I live in a food desert, or where I live close by, there's no access to fresh food that is unique to Black, brown, poor communities.
People are already seeing that it's a larger issue, and all of these things correlate. High blood pressure, obesity, asthma rates.
Most people, when they come on here, first of all, they're very curious and they don't know what to expect when they walk off that gangway. Once they get here, they're just like, wow, this is so beautiful. But they still don't understand that, like, you can pick stuff and eat stuff and take stuff home. And when we say, like, it's free, that's when people are like, oh, okay, this is for me.
It's okay to take it from the plants?
Yes. People cannot believe that there's corn growing on a barge.
We want to stop the disconnect and really transform the community so we have more healthy options.
The communities that need to grow food the most don't have access to private space. We have to start looking at our parks. We have to start looking at spaces that are underutilized and that we could consider places that we can go to for fresh food.
You won't believe how amazing Swale and how amazing Concrete Plant Park is until you come and see it. And being able to see that fruits and vegetables can grow in the Bronx, it's priceless. Like, you can't put a price tag on this stuff because it brings the community together, it informs the community, and it pushes for a better tomorrow and a better Bronx.
So that was Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice, and they did that video, and it really pushed the Parks Department to say, like, okay, we're going to do this now. So that's the first one, and if more people come forward and say we want this to happen in our park, they will do more, they've said, but they're really waiting for people to say, yeah, we could also care for this with you, because Parks Department doesn't want to be the only group to monitor it. So anyway, that's some of the stuff I've been working on that was like pre-pandemic, and at that point, the barge went back to the owner during the pandemic, and everything came off and was planted in a community garden and a park, and now we are fundraising to do a permanent barge. So that's the next step for that project, and that's what I've been working on for a while. Do you guys have any thoughts or questions? Or I could talk about, like, the financial part, which is interesting. Yeah, so let me just to say briefly that the water pod was all in-kind donations and people volunteering time and materials, because I didn't really have any experience doing this, and nobody would have given me funding to do it. But after that worked and went well, Swale had a Kickstarter campaign that went really well, and then a grant from an organization called The Blade of Grass to get started. And then we thought, okay, we have 6 months of funding for this project. If nobody wants it, it'll be gone in 6 months. And in 6 months, we got a sponsorship from a cider company called Strongbow, and we were able to inject $100,000 into the project and landscape the whole thing and plant apple trees and pay people to be there. And that was the start of 3 more years of successful fundraising for the project. So actually, it's really, I think, an interesting story. Yeah, but if anybody has specific questions, please feel free to ask. And thank you so much for listening. Yeah. Questions? Yeah.
It was really interesting how you were talking about that meeting with the Coast Guard, right? And how they looked at the project and they said, well, this, that, the other thing won't work.
Sorry for the interruption, WHS. If Natasha Dalby is in the building, please report to the main office. Natasha Dalby to the main office.
So they basically said, like, this won't work this way.
Yeah.
But you were able to pivot and think flexibly, and the takeaway was they're on board, but we have to reconfigure the project.
Yeah, I think because they didn't say no, and they said, if you do it this way, like they said, 10 years of experience, whatever that means, or lots of money, or using a pre-made structure. And we thought, oh, well, we'll look at the pre-made structures and see what's big enough. And then we came up with a barge. And then they said, yeah, no problem.
My question is, you said, well, we worked with lawyers, we worked with engineers, we worked with all of these other people who are willing to work on this project. Can you say a little bit about how you connect with these people, whether you are paying them through grant money, or maybe speak a little bit towards like the willingness of people to jump into a project like this because they're excited about the possible opportunities?
Yeah, I think because the Coast Guard said yes, then I could go to New York City Mayor's office, and they have a Department of Cultural Affairs, and I could say, hey, this could happen. All we need to know is how, like what we need for permits. And so they thought, okay, these people are coming here, they're not asking for money, but they want to know like how to make this happen, and Coast Guard's supporting it. So what do we have to lose? So it started like that, and then as we started to have a relationship with the Department of Cultural Affairs, we were granted an intern who was working with us to help the project along. And I have to say that relationship went really far, because everybody who we would come into contact with, we would say, and here's Jessica from the Department of Cultural Affairs. And people were like, okay, maybe we could talk with this law firm, because they could sponsor the project pro bono. They have to do a certain amount of pro bono work every year, and this might be one for them. So we talked with many different law firms, and finally we found one who said, yeah, we would be interested in sponsoring it. And we talked with them and asked what else we needed. And they said, well, you need an engineer if we're going to work with you. And we asked, do you have any idea of somebody who would be interested? And they would say, yeah, Rick Van Hemmen from Martin Ottaway, he'd be interested in this experiment. And so we meet with Rick, and Rick said, hey, if there's a generator on this, I'm not interested. But if it's completely self-sufficient, like you say, yeah, it's amusing to me. Like, I'd like to see what happens. So that relationship led to another one. But I think that there were some catalysts along the way. Like the Coast Guard was a big catalyst, and then getting to work with the intern at the mayor's office was a big catalyst. And finally, by the end of 3 years, I don't know, 200 people are working on the project in different capacities. And by the end of the project, like 200,000 people come to visit. So it just becomes exponential. And the best part about that versus maybe doing the photographs of the wearable homes that I was showing is just how many people you met who were already doing awesome work, who would come to the barge and would say, hey, you could do this a lot better if you just did it this way. And so over the course of 6 months, we're rearranging this entire barge to make it work better based on what people from all over the world have to tell about like a living system, which, yeah, so it ends up being really collaborative, and if you think about it that way. Yeah. Yeah. During that project, I gave up my apartment and lived on it. That was like, I didn't have to make any money. But during Swale, what did I do? I mean, I was speaking, and that was really helpful, and I sold enough photographs to like pay for my living. Yeah, I would say I'm kind of a hustler in that way. Like I have like lots of different income streams, and sometimes I need to go this way. But in the last couple of years, I've been doing a lot of teaching. Yeah. Yeah.
Like a lot of your projects, there's like a lot of greenery and like gardens and stuff. And like especially on the last one, like I didn't even know it was like possible to grow corn that was like anywhere other than a cornfield. So like, is it like hard to like maintain such a big garden with like a bunch of people coming into it, or is it like kind of like self?
That's a good question. The first garden, it was really hard, and we spent so much time like working on those gardens to have enough food for the 5 of us to eat. Like that's all we did pretty much. But on the second garden, Swale, it was all perennial plants, so everything grew back every year. So we didn't have to do much maintenance at all. What we had was a layer of gravel, a layer of lava rock, soil, and compost, and then we just planted. A lot of them we started with seedlings, and then they just came back every year. Like people would pick, and it would grow back that same season. So it's pretty cool. Yeah, it was easy. Yeah.
Could you expand on that carbon layer you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, so you can make your own carbon. Carbon is the best for cleaning water, I learned. And when I was making those wearable homes, I could like take corn husks, and I could smolder a fire, and then I could make carbon that would clean water. So it's a different type of carbon. It's not like if you just have a wood fire and then you make ash. Carbonated charcoal does something biologically to the layer, so it's activated and then it cleans water. And it's very easy, and it's expensive if you buy it, but it's free if you make it, almost. Yeah. Any other questions? Good questions.
What were the best parts about living on the water pod and the hardest?
Well, I mean, I think it was hard to live with 4 people and not leave the space. And I think when I left a few times. One, to go to the doctor because I had a splinter. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I got off that barge. And it felt so good because I realized that I was really myopic. Like I was only thinking about what people noticed when they came onto the barge, like what book I was reading, like if I had a pimple or something. Like I just was really obsessed with what people thought when they entered the barge. And then I got off and I was like, oh, nobody cares. It's a big world. Like there's lots going on. Why was I concerned at all? So that was a really good thing about, like getting off the barge was important, is my point. Living closely with people, you don't leave a space. You also get into silly fights. And the best part was when people came on and they told us how to make the system better. Like that was why I think I loved living on that project. I just wanted it to go on because I was learning so much. It was very cool. Yeah. Yeah.
One thing we think about is like, what's the aftermath of a great project? So how does learning connect to other learning? And I know that you mentioned that you have a future project that you're jumping into. Like, what are you envisioning, where do you envision the work going in the future? And that might be hard because it feels like a lot of the time the work that you're doing is kind of directing you and leading you in a certain way, so the experience really helps direct you. What's the vision down the line? Are you looking forward to anything?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think on Swale I learned that like maybe more important than actually doing the project was maintaining it. And that's not something you want to think about often as an artist. It's like, okay, now there's all this maintenance that has to happen. But it was more important in terms of being a provocation and a catalyst for something else to happen, was that it was always maintained and in good condition and people wanted to come. It was always active. And so the next version of Swale, like it will have to have that, of course, and because it's going to be a permanent structure, I'd really like to think through sea level rise. I mean, there have been a few storms where my apartment has flooded, and that has made me think about salt tolerant plants, and that's exciting to think about. Like what are the plants that we eat that could also withstand a lot of saltwater inundation? And tomatoes, potatoes, cabbage, kales, all those plants can do okay in salt water, onions, all the stuff you really want to eat, broccoli. So having a food forest that grows that stuff too is going to be important in the next version. Yeah. And having a place where, go ahead.
We know major cities are having political problems, safety problems. How do you approach government and say, this can help?
I think the way that Swale worked was saying, here it is, here's an example of how it could work, and what if part of this was taken off? And I think that's how the water pod worked too. People could come on and say, hey, I don't really like the idea of this barge, and actually it's really dirty, but your compost system is awesome, and I'm gonna do that at home. So I think it's just like modeling it and then taking some, people generate their own ideas from that. But
you have problems, do you get feedback from government agencies balancing the importance of sustainability and lifestyles as they appear, as they have?
yeah, I mean, I think they're, depending on who's in office, like Mayor Eric Adams is a really important advocate for food. He's a diabetic, and he became vegetarian, and now his actions are really based around food, some of them at least. I mean, people have mixed opinions about him, but that's, in terms of this project, that's really relevant. I think it depends on the politician, their agenda, and finding a way in,
you're
Yeah.
an artist, do they take you seriously? Like that title, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's to the advantage of the artist, certainly, because, for instance, people would have been afraid of the water pod if it was an ecological project, but it's an art project. Okay, you know. But depending on who I'm talking to, I might say, it's not an art project. Like, it's an ecological project.
Sometimes, like, even when I was talking about your work, I'm like, she's an artist, but she's also, and
Yeah.
I'm like, wait a minute, no, she's an artist. Like, that's
Yeah.
good, that's enough, like, that's important. I don't know, why am I saying but, you know,
Yeah.
like, it's okay that you're an artist. I don't know.
Yeah, I think
What's
that,
interesting about your work, like, the way you talk about yourself, does that change what people's perceptions
yeah.
are?
But I think that can be a powerful tool for an artist, because you can shapeshift if you need to.
Yeah.
Have a lot of different skills, I guess. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary.
Thank you all. Yeah.